Hey guys, this is part 3 of water pollution. Part 2, I ended with talking about how industry uses the cold water, heats it up, and then puts it back. And we gave you an example of um, Florida, and this is just the write-up of that. It's called a thermal plume when you have hot water pumped back um, into a cold environment. It's called the thermal plume. It obviously kills off everything just because most organisms are very well suited to living in that narrow range of temperature. They are not used to living in scalding boiling water. And think about it, if you put scalding fish into scalding and boiling water, you tend to cook them. So with all this going on in 1972, we decided we need to have some kind of thanks to President Nixon. They decided that they were going to have some kind of system to take care of this pollution discharge into water bodies, because the public actually rose against this. One of the reasons why all of this happened was because of the protests in Cleveland, Lake Erie, and I will get to that in a second. However, again, over a course of time, while Clean Water Act still remains, like I think in the previous videos I've talked about it, an act is only powerful if it has some teeth behind it. That is, if there's some kind of legal ramifications for breaking the law, and if there is enough funding available to have actually inspectors to go out there and look at all the water bodies. So Clean Water Act, basically the only thing it affected was the sewage treatment system, which is good, which is better than nothing, but the spirit of the law has never been abided by. So right now in 1998, EPA took it over, and instead of monitoring individual factories and individual lakes, they started monitoring it statewide, which actually made it slightly worse, because when you had the Clean Water Act, funding came across. When funding was given to Clean Water Act, it was just for that one act. So that money went into enforcing that one law. But when they merged it with EPA, the EPA has so many other divisions and branches and so many other areas that they have to take care of. For example, they have to take care of water pollution, air pollution, making sure that the ecosystem stays well. A part of endangered species as a part of ecosystem. So it kind of got diluted and lost because there are so many things that EPA has to take care of. So once there's a budget cut for EPA, everything suffers. So by just merely taking the Clean Water Act, and instead of having it as a law by itself, and having, as much as we might hate bureaucracy involved in it, instead of having a department to monitor cleanliness of water and water pollution, once it got merged with the EPA, you got 4 inspectors for a state, and they have to monitor both water pollution, air pollution, contaminants, mining, thermal pollution. They have to make sure that the hydro vents are taken care of. They have to make sure that invasive species don't exist. It's just not physically possible for 4 people to do this. Actually, 4 is an amazing number. In Virginia, last couple of years back, in Virginia, where they had this massive spill into the river, they actually had only 1 inspector for the whole state. So that is a huge problem. Now, one of the reasons we do have the Clean Water Act is Lake Erie. Lake Erie is one of the reason is Lake Erie. Lake Erie is one of the Great Lakes. So in the 1960s, it was considered to be a dead lake. It was due to eutrophication. Farms were dumping their waste in it. The cities were dumping their waste in it. There were a couple of factories that were dumping their waste in it. It was just a dumping ground, to the point where at one point of time, all the fish in the lake actually died out and was floating on top of the water. There was huge algae blooms that cut off oxygen to the bottom. And towards by 1962, 63, there was the lake was on fire. So when water is on fire, that is just not a good thing. The people of Cleveland really took to the streets. They protested. There were some very interesting cartoons that were made about Lake Erie. And that's where by 1972, we had the Clean Water Act, and a lot of money was put into cleaning up. It became a federal government. Federal government actually stepped in, took control of it, and cleaned up the lake. And by 1998, they started having mayflies in that lake. Mayflies, just like lichen, mayflies are aquatic insects that indicate the health of that lake. So from 1960s to 1980s, once there was the will of the people and once there was proper laws governing what went into the water and was a proper cleanup process, in 30 years, it went from becoming a dead, burning lake to actually having indicator species like mayflies living there. Today, it is the walleye capital of the world. That's a fish. Now, the other thing also is, at the same time, Lake Erie still requires a lot of work because so much nitrates and phosphates were actually dumped into that lake that the nutritional content of the sediment underneath cannot be changed. It's very, very high. So the lake is actually very much prone to algae blooms. Money constantly is required to monitor these lakes. Luckily, so far they've been doing it. Doesn't mean that they're going to keep doing that. The other thing that we've talked about this is cattle feedlot. Remember this number feedlots, they produce a ton of manure. There's not a proper method to actually monitor where this is going. Most places they just dilute it and dump it into the river. So that becomes a non-point source. Again, if you go back and look at what happened with Lake Erie, this was a non-point source too. If it's a non-point source, it is really, really difficult to punish anyone. So it goes back to that when we were talking about pastures, and it becomes a tragedy of commons. Nobody is responsible. Nobody wants to take responsibility for cleaning up a whole gosh darn lake. It's very expensive. Nobody can be directly blamed, so everybody can get away with doing it. Most of us do this. Pet waste, the poop that your dogs create, actually does not go through any kind of sewage system. They just sit there and they go into a landfill. They sit there and eventually produce a ton of methane gas, which is not good for global warming. Now, in certain countries, in the poorest of poor countries, they do something called as biogas. So a biogas unit is, they collect all the animal waste, put it into sealed containers, and these sealed containers, over a period of time, a ton of methane gas is created, and that methane gas is used for electricity, it's used for cooking gas, and a whole bunch of different things, which is an amazing way of taking care of animal waste, because once you've gone through that process where bacteria has actually worked on this manure, then that manure is used in agriculture. So they poorer countries have a better way of recycling this than richer countries do. In the United States, we really don't have a way of recycling it. I think North Carolina has something, and the University of North Carolina did a study about this, and I think I spoke about this in chapter 17, where they literally have what they call mountains of shit. That's just what it is. So certain poor countries do have a better way of doing this, but at the same time, remember, when you are a poorer country, you don't have the money to support any kind of cleanup action. You have people who access water directly from a river because they don't have running water at home. You have people drinking, eating, shitting, washing, living by riverbanks. And India is actually the king of polluted water because river Yamuna and river Ganges, river Ganges, both these rivers are considered to be sacred within the Indian culture. So when people don't have enough money to burn their dead, burning their dead ritualistically is a very expensive process. When poorer people don't have enough money to burn their dead, because in Indian mythology or in Hinduism, it is, if you don't burn your dead and don't take the ashes and put it into river Ganges or river Yamuna, the feeling is that, the sentiment is that that person is not going to go to heaven. So if you don't have enough money to burn your dead and you still want to put their ashes into river Yamuna, you just let half burnt bodies float into the river. At one point of time, it was so bad. I think it was in the 90s, early 2000s. It was so bad that there were hundreds of dead, half burnt dead bodies, human dead bodies floating in the river. Now, couple of things. 95% of the United States population actually depends on water. They depend for water. They depend on the aquifers, and we have talked about this in the past. That once your aquifer or your artisanal well water is contaminated, it is very, very, very difficult. It takes decades and decades and decades to get it cleaned. There's no mechanism that allows us to go underground and clean that water up. Unfortunately, now we're finding MTBE in the water, in groundwater, which is a gasoline additive. Now, one of the reasons for that is because we a love for a drilling of oil very close to aquifers. So problem. We also a love for setting up refineries very close to aquifers. Now, again, it goes back to that same thing. We need the jobs, we need the oil, and we need the water. So there has to be, unless there's a proper economic solution to this problem, as much as we would like to say rah the environment, let's close down all of these things, it's not a viable option. When you write your essays, just make sure you talk about that. Make sure that you talk about the economical impact of it. It is very, very easy to say that we need an environmental a solution to protect our environment. But if that solution is not economically viable, if it displaces a lot of people, if it causes people a ton of hardships, if people lose a lot of their jobs, that solution will not last long. Actually, that solution will probably not get passed. So this gives you a list of, make sure that you kind of memorize these facts. This is a very important fact to memorize. Make sure you memorize this fact. Again, in the previous slides, we've talked about septic tanks. A crack in the septic tanks will actually start contaminating the groundwater. Landfills, I'm sure you guys remember the difference between regular landfills and sanitary landfills. Sanitary landfills are a little better at protecting our aquifers, but not the best option. This gives you an idea of how groundwater pollution takes place. We have done this in chapter 17. I've gone over this in chapter 17. So like I said, when you are taking a test on chapter 18, it would really benefits you to go over chapter 17. Just go over the videos in chapter 17 and then go into 18. Um, um, cup, Besides all the contaminants, there's also the fact that you could have fecal matter, coliform contamination in the water. Now, we've always heard don't drink water in third world countries, but don't drink water in some places in America.